No end in sight. That's how one Border Patrol chief described the influx of migrants in the Rio Grande Valley sector of the southern border in March 2021. No end in sight. That was 2.5 years ago, Mr. President. And there's still no end in sight to this crisis. On Friday, we learned that 232,972 individuals were caught trying to illegally cross our southern border in the month of August. 232,972. That is the highest August number yet for the Biden administration. And all signs suggest that we're on track for a third record-breaking year of apprehensions at the southern border. In fact, roughly 11,000 individuals were apprehended attempting to cross our southern border in just 24 hours this past weekend. 11,000 in 24 hours. If the White House really thinks it's, quote, stopping the flow at the border, as the White House press secretary said last month, it should think again. And Mr. President, it's important to note that the numbers I've mentioned only reflect individuals who were actually apprehended. They don't include individuals who have made their way into the country illegally without being caught. Since the beginning of the Biden administration, there have been at least 1.5 million known gotaways, individuals the Border Patrol detected but was unable to apprehend. Mr. President, the Biden administration's so-called border plan is clearly not working, and state and local governments are stretched thin. And I'm not just talking about border towns and border states. I'm talking about places like New York City, Chicago, Massachusetts. As migrants flood into these locations, blue states and blue cities are learning what border states have been experiencing for years. And they're struggling with the cost that this crisis is imposing. Denver, Colorado, has spent almost $25 million sheltering migrants. Chicago is projected to spend more than $250 million this year on migrant care. And New York City could spend $12 billion with a B, by 2025 on the migrant crisis, possibly precipitating cuts to city services. And just to give you one example of the current crisis, the city's begun housing 3,000 illegal immigrants at a makeshift shelter on local soccer fields, eliminating a popular source of activity and recreation for local children. Here's what New York City Mayor Eric Adams had to say about this crisis the other day, and I quote, "Let me tell you something, New Yorkers. Never in my life have I had a problem that I did not see an ending to. I don't see an ending to this. This issue will destroy New York City." End quote. That from the mayor of New York, Mr. President. Mr. President, the border crisis we're experiencing is the predictable outcome of decisions made early in the Biden administration. The President's team was warned of the possibility of a migrant surge. Yet the moment the President took office, he set about dismantling the immigration policies of his predecessor and weakening our nation's border security. And it wasn't long before the border was overwhelmed. And while after 2 years, the Biden administration finally started to at least half-heartedly acknowledge the border crisis, what few proactive measures the administration has taken have been ineffective, to say the least. As one columnist put it recently in the Washington Post, and I quote, "The Biden administration's various efforts have amounted to Band-Aids on a massive open wound." End quote. I'm also deeply concerned about some of the new policies the administration seems to be considering. The Department of Homeland Security is reported to be considering requiring some illegal migrants to remain in Texas or perhaps other border states while they await asylum screening. Now, Mr. President, I'm not sure if this is an attempt to spare blue states from having to deal with a border crisis, or a recognition that releasing tens of thousands of illegal immigrants into the interior of the country isn't a good idea. But regardless, forcing border communities to shoulder even more of the burden of this crisis is a terrible and profoundly unjust idea. How about actually turning illegal immigrants back at the borders of this country instead of keeping them within the borders of border states? And then there's the supplemental funding request the White House sent to Congress. As our colleague Senator Hagerty has pointed out, the request includes a provision that would allow immigration and customs enforcement funding to be used for shelters and migrant services. In the words of the senator from Tennessee, this could, and I quote, effectively convert ICE from a law enforcement agency into a U.S. travel agency for illegal aliens and into a grant-making bureaucracy for sanctuary cities, end quote. Mr. President, I'm pleased that the administration and Mexico have reached an agreement in which Mexico will attempt to reduce pressure on its border cities by sending migrants back to their home countries, among other reforms. But after letting this crisis deepen for 2.5 years, the administration has a lot more work to do. Mr. President, currently immigration is high on Americans' list of concerns. And it's no wonder. Americans can tell that our borders are open and that things are not getting better. And they know that our current situation is not sustainable. It'd be nice if the President could figure that out as well. Mr. President, ultimately it's really quite simple. President Biden created this crisis. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And he has the power to end it. He just needs to decide that he's going to enforce the law. Pure and simple. Unfortunately, until he does so, I'm afraid that it will continue to be no end in sight at our southern border. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.